Hello and welcome back to the channel and another design tutorial for PGA Tour 2K25 here at Shell Bay Links. And in this one we're going to look over everything to do with surface weathering, which is a really intuitive tool to use that also opens up a bunch of new looks and variability for us. So in this tutorial I'm going to explain everything about that, how you can best leverage it for your courses. Enjoy. So what exactly is surface weathering? Well, to answer that, we're going to start by looking at our old favourite textures that we've had for years. Fairway textures, you may recall that in 23 HP gave us more of these, so we got up to 50 or so. But even then, we still tended towards the ones with a little bit more nuance. Some of them kind of change colours a little bit, and we've always wanted more control over them. These were the global settings that all of your fairways would look exactly like this colour everywhere on the course. And the same was true with light rough, greens, heavy rough, etc. Now, what surface weathering gives us a chance to do is actually control that, and it's really a blending tool more than anything else. So at its base level, you want to consider this as a browning one. So we're going to go to brushes. It runs off the usual sculpting terrain painting system. So if we hit 100% there, the middle of that is going to the full browned out level, and around the outsides where the brush starts to break up and become a bit fuzzier, it's doing that less. So for example, we go to that brush and you'll see the impact dilutes ever so slightly. Additionally, though, we can control that via the intensity. So if I were to go to 70% intensity, say, it looks like this. If I were to go to 50 odd, like this, and gradually less so. And you can see from this that actually at 100% is really strong, and you kind of are getting a pretty big impact as low as 25% or so. Now, as with the terrain painting, you can control these brushes by overlapping them. So if we hit that 28% or 35 and just ran it around, say, you will keep some of the impact, but also blend between them. You can also remove it by going over it and lowering the intensity as well. And it's pretty intuitive to use because we're using that softer brush. It's not doing as much of a good job in lowering the intensity. We go to the harder one, it does this. So a lot of it you will get with practice, but it will take a bit of practice to get it exactly where you want it to. So that's it at its core, but what are these textures down below? Well, you may recall that we said in 23 these were your start points and your end points. Now your default fairway textures that we have here are your start points, and your surface weathering fairway texture is your end point. And we said that it was a blending tool. Well, what we're basically doing is blending the initial fairway texture with the one you choose to down here. Now, they have set this for most courses at 16, but if you're having any issues with it, just check that it's set correctly in here so that everything browns out. And that's going to be the one you want to default to. But we could change this to 5. And let's say you go into here, there's a really nice feature where you can choose just this one to change, or all types. And I'll show you examples later on where you might want to change it. So 5 gives us a slightly more, like, I guess, Highlandsy sort of blending, I guess. 46 would be a common one that you might want to use. It's slightly different again. You could choose to make it kind of a frosty look on the course. You could also go and look at making it more green. So if we put it to 21, you can see how it starts getting brighter in certain areas. The other thing you will notice is edge blending, and this is global across all of your surfaces. Now, in most situations, you are going to want to keep that at 100, because if I take it down to 5, you will see what it does. Essentially, just leaves the brushes like that, and it removes the fuzzy edges on all of them. There are some super rare occasions where you may want to change this, but 100% is going to give you the biggest amount of control. Now, additionally, we have more control over this. So say you wanted your light rough texture not to blend at all. Well, we can see the initial texture is on 11. And if we change it via surface weathering so that the light rough texture alone on surface weathering is also staying at 11, and we go just this selected type, well, then it's always going to stay the same no matter what brushes we put over it at 100%. And it will look a little bit weird because it's affecting either side of it, but you do have that control. You can equally create bespoke packs of greens weathering to one colour, fairways to another, etc. You can also spline this if you chose to. And again, by doing that, you can increase and decrease the intensity. And you can do this for a whole area, fill it in if you wanted to. There's ways in which you can do this. And you can see that that brush is overwriting the spline as well. So you want to be more careful with your brushes maybe than your splines. So that's the overview of how it works. Now how you go about applying it. Well, it still works on different brushes. So I would tend to use quite a big brush. It depends on the look you're going for. But personally, I quite like doing larger brushes that create more gradients rather than the kind of harder brushes where you might want to just do one area. This area is going to be browner, because I find that that transitions slightly less well. But you can always paint over it again, for lack of a better word, and change this by just doodling on your fairways is one way to do it. Some of the more interesting ones, you could use this guy, whereas a lot of different kind of opacities throughout it, intensities, and that will create quite a nice layered look. Same with this one. We'll do quite a lot where you're getting a bit more of a mottled look on your fairways if you want to, or green. Additionally, you can do it just by going really bespoke, and let's say we're going to do this runoff here, because we're saying that that's going to be more browned out. You want to think about where you're doing it. We can run that around it, and you can see that those sorts of areas become a bit more distinct and highlighted. And you may choose to paint over it in a little bit of green and create some variance within it as well. What you might want to do is kind of at the top of mounds or hills where it's more likely to get burned, or let's say get bladed by mowers, you could put this on. You could also use it to highlight green breaks, which are quite a nice way of doing it. And those will then be seen back from the fairway. So you can see how we can visualize green breaks a little bit more. The final and probably major impact of this is the new fescue grasses, which we'll go through in a second, also react to the weathering, and they basically turn whatever colour the heavy rough is underneath it. So we can add some intensity and run these brushes around it, and you can see the grasses changing colour. Again, this depends on the intensity that you choose. For most courses, you're going to want to be around the 30% mark if you were using this brush. Now, when I say that they react to the heavy rough texture and change colour, they really do. So for example, where we've changed this to winter, our grasses start going more white. If we were to go to the 40, say, they go a bit more green, and it's harder to notice because they started out green. If you were to go to a 50, say, then they go a little bit lighter again. There's different looks that you can accomplish with this, but for most of them, you're going to want to stick with the base 16 heavy rough. However, if you were to change your default heavy rough texture to one of the very brighter green ones, which I've done with 48, say, but let's say we put it to 47, you can start seeing you get that more variance in color as well as to how the weathering is impacting. So everything kind of plays together, and you're going to want to, again, experiment a little bit before you start deciding exactly what look you're going for. Now, as for the fescue grasses that react to this, it's quite straightforward to tell which ones. They're on the first page and the second page and the very top left one on the third page. All of the old models won't react to the weathering, you can see as you put them across. Whereas if we go for the new ones and multi-plant, you can start seeing them changing colour as we move them around, which is a really nice visual feature for working out what they're going to look like. So now for some slightly more advanced stuff, and it may surprise you to look at Huntington Sound and realise that the base heavy rough texture is actually this very deep green 32. However, it's been heavily weathered, so if we look at our surface weathering tool, I ended up changing this to 46 on this one because I kind of liked the way it looked. I went to 16, gives you an idea as to it just gets a bit stronger, whereas this gave that slightly more muted look I was after. Now, if we turn off the surface weathering, again, we can use our filters to do this. So we're just going to hide everything on the surface weathering, and you'll see what the course originally looked like. And it's very different. So one thing you want to consider is actually the starting point is a really good way to blend into that deeper texture. By going for a very green and blending to the brown, you get a real variance and spectrum of colours that you wouldn't do if you started on that usual base texture that you might expect. Now, this concept is not unique to Huntington Sound. With Salem Creek, I chose to have the default heavy rough texture at 48 and then weather it towards that 16. And again, you'll see if we go to our filters and turn that off, you will see the changes that that makes. So if we hide surface weathering, and this is what the course would have initially looked like. So it's very, very different. However, I did one other thing a little bit differently on this one, which was with the greens, I wanted to show up some of the breaks and make those a little bit more mottled and nuanced. I really like how they came out. The way in which I did that was actually the base green texture is the one that it's weathering to. So all of the greens are covered by surface weathering brushes. I tried doing it where I was just highlighting the breaks and the tiers and things, and I didn't like that as much. So in fact, I painted over kind of the insides of all of these and left these as the brighter color. And that to me worked a little bit better. And you can see a lot of the greens have that kind of mottled, interesting nature where it's not too overt. You're not seeing like bright green in one area, deeper greens in another area. It's more subtle, which I felt fitted this course better. Now, one other thing to notice is that there's none of the fescue grasses on this course. I just preferred the way the old ones looked, so don't feel you have to upgrade everything. Sometimes the ones you used originally are still the best ones. They've not become obsolete. Back to Shell Bay before our final look at surface weathering, and you can see how you can use it to create much better farmland. Previously we were having to paint on mulch texture, but here these are all just different forms of heavy rough, either splined or weathered with brushes to get different looks. So all of this is just different intensities, sometimes fairway, sometimes heavy rough, occasionally light rough, and then just painted on, and I think it looks pretty damn fantastic. With the fields, these are a very high intensity with lots of grass, and then occasionally you can do the kind of furrowed mow lines of surface weathering at a very high level, so 40, and then sculpted up just a little bit to make them pop a little bit more. Now for our final cool weathering trick, and I'm sure there'll be others, we come back to Combe Point, which you've seen briefly in one of the tutorials, and you'll notice the mow lines on the fairway. Now, sadly, we still don't have a way of doing this automatically and getting the half and half. However, you can do this look with some very careful and clever weathering. So there are a few things to do around this. First of all, in this one, I'm weathering to the deep green. I can't remember why I did that, but there was a reason. And with this, all of this surface is at 100% intensity, and you want to make your path as narrow as possible. You also want to set it so that your light rough is relatively wide, because if you pull this point too far over, it will start burning onto the heavy rough, which you don't want to do. Additionally, your light rough needs to be set to exactly the same texture for what it's weathering from and to. So your same base light rough texture, so 8, and then the surface weathering texture would also be 8. And that's basically acting as your buffer between the edge of the fairway and the heavy rough, because you still want to be able to weather some of these grasses in this way. And then the final thing that is going to make this work is you can control the intensity of that mow line through the edge blending. Now, this is the only time when I would ever change it away from 100. You could get a super fine mow line down like this, which looks really cool. Unfortunately, due to it being a global texture, it also ruins your heavy rough blending of your fescue grasses. So if you were to go back to 100 on this, you get full control over here, but you get a mow line that is less than ideal. And I wanted it to be quite tight. So 50 seemed like the perfect balance. Now, please, this is time consuming and it's not necessarily worth it, but for this course, I think it makes it really pop. And hopefully, once they sort out an issue with the autogen grass having just disappeared, this one will be with you pretty soon after launch. So that is our surface weathering tutorial and everything as yet that I've found out about this tool. Now, I think it's something that gives you a huge amount of control over how you want your course to look, as well as with the grasses, that gives very different looks that we can create. It's also something that is a lot of fun to use and very intuitive. So it's a tool that's had a load of thought go into it in terms of how it is user facing. If you understand sculpting and terrain painting, you'll be just fine. Hopefully you enjoy and see you again next time.